Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Sunday everybody. I know that I said that today would be a day off, but there is simply too much to cover, and so we do have to do one extra episode today. As usual, this is a foreign policy and ideology focused episode. Let's start with the South China Sea. We've been following the tensions between China and US ally the Philippines very closely these last several weeks. Along with Taiwan, the South China Sea represents one of the most serious flashpoints which could trigger a conflict, whether unintentional or not, between the US and China. The most recent incident was last week. We now have several reports from foreign reporters who accompanied the Philippines Coast Guard on the resupply mission to the grounded Sierra Madre at 2nd Thomas Shoal. One of the reporters was for the US-based New York Times. In a piece titled, "The Beached Philippine Ship That Is Angering China," the outlet writes that the Philippines has portrayed its struggle against China as one of David and Goliath. After multiple clashes in recent years, the Philippine Coast Guard has started inviting journalists on its missions to resupply the handful of people remaining on the ship. It is part of a public relations strategy, writes the outlet, to show the world how Beijing is asserting its might in the South China Sea. Decades of leaving the ship exposed to the elements have worn down the vessel. In 2018, the Philippine government commissioned a study to examine its viability and concluded that it only had about 2 years left while intact before beginning to deteriorate. Philippine officials fear that when the ship falls apart, China will swoop in to claim the shoal, a submerged reef that is rich with fish and serves as a gateway to the area believed to contain vast resources of oil and natural gas. We have discussed all this before. US-based Bloomberg also sent a reporter in an article titled, "Aboard a Philippine patrol ship in waters claimed by China." The outlet writes, Manila is increasingly worried that its dilapidated outpost, with gaping holes in its structure, will soon fall apart. China over the years has been playing the long game, it writes, hoping that water and rust will take care of the issue for it, making the ship uninhabitable. To prevent this fate, the Philippines, under an assertive Marcos, has been trying to get not just food and medical supplies to the small contingent of Marines stationed on the Sierra Madre, but also equipment and materials to shore up the vessel. That has raised Beijing's ire, writes Bloomberg, and it has aggressively tried to stop Manila's resupply operations, including by using water cannons to scare off Filipino boats. Last month, vessels from the two countries collided on 2 separate occasions. We followed this at the time. The outlet writes that with last week's incident, China had a fleet of 28 fishing vessels, 5 Coast Guard boats, 5 military vessels, including a fast attack craft, and even a hospital ship. The Philippines deployed 3 Coast Guard vessels and 2 resupply ships. The situation is very dangerous, of course. However, some analysts argue that the Philippines' decision to take journalists on these missions is a clever strategy to deal with Chinese so-called grey zone tactics and mitigate, to some degree, the large power asymmetry. Senior analysts with the Washington-based Center for Strategic and International Studies, Greg Polling and Jude Blanchett, argued in a piece this week that, quote, Beijing's strong arming of the Philippines plays right into Washington's hands, end quote, writing that the situation around the 2nd Thomas Shoal highlights a key feature of China's foreign policy, its refusal to acknowledge that the Philippines and other small states have their own agency in disputes with Beijing. This worldview was amply summed up in a piece by the Global Times, which concludes, quote, by escalating the tensions, the Philippines likely wants to draw support from the United States, or the entire farce was staged by the US in the first place, end quote. The two analysts continue. When Chinese leaders confront a medium or small power that challenges or offends Beijing, they often accuse the smaller power of working in tandem with or being used by the United States to drive an anti-China strategy. This sentiment is also the reason that Beijing sought to undermine the arbitration case brought by the Philippines in 2013 by insisting that it was engineered by the United States and Japan. And it's why, after every Philippine diplomatic objection over the violence at 2nd Thomas Shoal, Chinese officials ignore the substance of the complaints and lecture their Filipino counterparts about being pawns of a US plot. On this point, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. aired his frustrations, asserting, quote, "This not only denies us our independence and our agency, but also disregards our own legitimate interests," end quote. Beijing isn't ready to acknowledge that Manila, Poling and Blanchett argue, or any other Southeast Asian claimant has legitimate grievances that must be addressed to peacefully manage disputes. Quote, "Beijing seems to believe that other states are less committed to their sovereignty and rights, defy China only because of American influence, and will eventually buckle in the face of sustained pressure. Running the same coercive play over and over at Second Thomas Scholl seems unlikely to change Philippine policy and will only lead to further collisions and risk escalation." End quote. The two senior analysts argue that there are two driving forces behind this aspect of China's regional foreign policy: Beijing's vision of regional hierarchy and its fear of US containment. They explain, in China's long-embedded view of regional hierarchy, smaller states are historically and necessarily subservient to Beijing in the Asian pecking order. Long legacies of traditional tributary state relations with China, as well as the historical dominance of Chinese culture, language, and economic power in the region, still linger in the minds of Beijing's decision-makers. Chinese leaders, they argue, also genuinely see the US as an architect of a long-term containment strategy that seeks to undermine China's regional influence, or worse, to bring about the collapse of the Chinese party. Quote, "Beijing's unwillingness to treat the concerns and grievances of its regional neighbors as legitimate has now become one of the most prominent challenges to its management of external relations. As US officials admit privately, the Biden administration's progress in strengthening relations with countries across the region, from Australia to India to the Philippines, is less a story of diplomatic acumen and more one of Chinese truculence. Should Beijing adjust course and begin treating regional actors as partners, not irritants, the Washington's Indo-Pacific strategy may face its greatest challenge yet." End quote. We end part one of today's episode by briefly examining a recent speech on maritime governance from China's top diplomat Wang Yi at the 4th Symposium on Maritime Cooperation and Ocean Governance. In the speech, we can see the same points about how China views the dynamics of the region, which Poling and Blanchett just identified in their piece. In his speech, Wang Yi said that China, quote, "will fulfill its obligations under the international law of the sea, including the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea," end quote, but then added, quote, "The South China Sea arbitration is an example of political manipulation of the international rule of the law of the sea," end quote. And so, instead, quote, "disputes over maritime territory and historic rights and interests should be resolved through friendly consultation between parties directly concerned," end quote. That is to say, these small countries should negotiate one-on-one with China. Wang Yi also attacked, quote, "Cold War mentality and zero-sum thinking that threaten peace and stability at sea," end quote. Speaking at the same forum, Sun Weidong, China's foreign vice minister, said Beijing rejected, quote, "the formation of exclusive blocs," end quote, adding, quote, "we will refrain from taking unilateral actions that lead to maritime tensions and resolutely oppose close reconnaissance and the threat of force that jeopardizes China's coastline and security," end quote. In response to these comments, G7 foreign ministers from Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States, as well as the High Representative of the European Union, released a joint statement expressing, quote, "We underscore that China has a responsibility to uphold the purposes and principles of the UN Charter in their entirety. We remain seriously concerned about the situation in the East and South China Seas, strongly opposing any unilateral attempts to change the status quo by force or coercion. We reiterate that the award rendered by the Arbitration Tribunal on July 12, 2016 is a significant milestone, which is legally binding upon the parties to those proceedings, and a useful basis for peacefully resolving disputes between the parties," end quote. Next up, China's global order. If you're enjoying today's special Sunday episode of China Update, don't forget to hit the like button. If you can share this episode with someone who you think would enjoy it too, or get some value from it too, that is a huge help. And Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below For anyone who can help me continue keeping the channel financially sustainable, open and free for all, 6 days and this week 7 days a week, thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Next up, we move to ideology. Regular viewers are very familiar with Beijing's vision for its own world order, an alternative to the current Western, US-led liberal world order. There are new articles on this being published almost every day now in Beijing. For our purposes, we only need to cover the most important and authoritative ones. Today we will examine a piece from Liu Jianchao, Minister of the International Department of the Party Central Committee in the state-run China Daily, where he lays out how the Global South should work with China to further Beijing's vision for a new global order. We note the ideas and rhetoric in the piece. There is a very loud Chinese gentleman outside. Let's just wait a moment. Okay, we're now quoting excerpts from the piece directly, and like I said, we note the ideas and rhetoric throughout the article. The countries of the Global South once suffered from aggression, colonization, suppression and plunder. It is through years of struggle and hard work, along with the evolving changes in this century, that the Global South has gradually become an important force, driving the reforms in the world order and seeking political independence, national rejuvenation and international justice. Unilateralism, protectionism and populism are rearing their ugly heads today. The few traditional powers that have dominated the right to set the international agenda and rules have always put their own interests first. Their hegemonic, domineering and bullying practices have disturbed the normal international order and undermined international justice and fairness. Under the new circumstances, more and more Global South countries have realized the ideological and institutional yoke of imperialism and colonialism, and they are more determined than ever to seek strategic autonomy, practice true multilateralism, and promote greater democracy in international relations. By doing so, the countries of the Global South have gained a greater say on the international stage and added new impetus to the reform of the global governance system. In an international system that is neither fair nor reasonable, the North-South divide continues to widen. The next part is especially telling. The ideological superstructure shines through. The Global South must take measures to break the myth that modernization equals westernization. For a long time, people believed westernization is modernization. In fact, modernization is not a single answer question. Different historical conditions lead to different choices of paths to modernization. The modernization of the West started with the expansion of capitalism and reached its peak with the help of colonialism, large-scale exploitation of other countries, and the use of power politics. It is an unjust path, and by no means a viable choice for the Global South. China has always supported the reasonable concerns of Global South countries. China is rooted in the Global South. It cares about the Global South. It has always stood in solidarity with the countries of the Global South through thick and thin. Here ends the direct quote. One South China Sea scholar, speaking on this piece, asked rather sardonically, "Is the Philippines not a member of the Global South?" Okay, that is today's special Sunday episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a good Sunday, have a great weekend, and I will see you all tomorrow.